At 0 to 2:47 hours local time, 6 Ukrainian long-range strike UAVs crossed into Saratov Oblast, flying low over frozen farmland toward Engels Air Base, home to Russia's Tu-95 and Tu-160 strategic bombers. These were the same aircraft that had launched cruise missiles into Ukrainian cities for 3 years. Tonight, Ukraine intended to make them pay for it on the ground. The base commander believed his defenses were more than sufficient. Engels sat nearly 400 miles from the nearest Ukrainian-controlled territory, protected by multiple Pantsir S-1 batteries, a rotating combat air patrol, an early warning radar chain, and one of the densest layers of ground-based air defense in southern Russia. On paper, no UAV should have been able to reach this deep without being detected within the first 50 miles of Russian airspace. What the Russians did not know was that Ukraine had spent 4 months mapping the exact gaps between overlapping radar coverage zones, seams in the net barely 3 miles wide, invisible on any single system's display, but real enough to fly through if the timing was perfect. This mission had not been assembled overnight. It had been built the way a locksmith studies a door, one pin at a time, until every weakness in the mechanism was known before the first attempt was ever made. Above the drone formation, a modified reconnaissance UAV held altitude at 12,000 feet, far above the strike group, silently relaying terrain data and wind corrections. It carried no warhead. Its only purpose was to see what the strike drones below could not, and to say nothing on the radio unless it absolutely had to. The 6 strike drones flew in a loose diamond, each holding just under 300 feet, skimming above tree lines and frozen irrigation canals to stay below the base station radar horizon. Their route had been chosen weeks in advance, threading between 2 known radar sites where refresh rates left brief blind windows every 11 seconds, windows measured and logged from months of passive signal monitoring along the border. 60 miles out, everything was still silent. The night was clear, temperature well below freezing, a light crosswind pushing from the northwest at 8 miles per hour, just enough to complicate acoustic detection without threatening the drone's stability. The formation held its diamond shape for the first 20 minutes, each drone maintaining a separation of roughly 400 feet, close enough to coordinate timing but far enough apart that a single radar sweep would struggle to resolve them as anything more than scattered noise. Inside each airframe, a small onboard processor cross-checked GPS position against a preloaded terrain model every 2 seconds, adjusting altitude in real time to hug the contour of the land below, rising slightly over a low ridge, dropping again into the shallow valley beyond it, never holding a straight, predictable line for more than a few hundred yards at a time. At 50 miles, the formation crossed a rural highway running east to west, empty at this hour except for a single long-haul truck whose headlights briefly illuminated the underside of one drone as it passed less than 100 feet overhead. The truck driver, half asleep at the wheel, registered nothing more than a strange shadow and kept driving. It was the kind of near-miss detection that had nothing to do with radar or electronic warfare and everything to do with simple human luck, the sort of variable that mission planners can prepare for but never fully eliminate. Then, at 42 miles, a mobile Nebo-M early warning radar caught a flicker. 1 week return, gone in under a second. The operator logged it as clutter, most likely a flock of birds disturbed by the cold front moving through the region, and moved on. It happened again 90 seconds later. This time, the operator did not dismiss it so easily. He flagged the sector for a secondary sweep and reported the anomaly up the chain. Engels Air Defense went to heightened alert. A Pantsir S-1 unit stationed at the base's northern perimeter rotated its radar cluster toward the suspected bearing, scanning for anything moving below 1,000 feet. Simultaneously, a second Pantsir battery on the eastern side of the base, normally held in reserve, was brought online and began its own independent search pattern. This was the first real test of the mission plan. 2 active radar systems now searching the same general sector, exactly the redundancy Ukrainian planners had hoped to avoid triggering this early. The Ukrainian formation split. 2 drones peeled east, climbing to 1,800 feet. Engines pushed to a higher throttle setting that increased both speed and radar signature. Their job was simple and brutal. Be seen, be chased, and die if necessary so the others could live. Like a matador snapping a cape to one side while the real danger approaches from the other direction, the decoys existed purely to control where the enemy's attention pointed. The northern Pantsir crew took the bait almost immediately. Their radar locked the 2 climbing drones and fired. 2 57 E-6 missiles streaked into the night sky, trailing thin white exhaust visible even from the ground crew's position more than a mile away. The first decoy drone was destroyed less than a mile from where it had first been detected. The explosion, a brief orange flash, swallowed almost instantly by the darkness. That drone's job was already complete. The second decoy banked hard, dropped nearly 40 feet in under 2 seconds, and evaded the proximity blast by less than 30 feet, badly damaged but still airborne, one motor running rough and losing power. With the northern Pantsir's radar locked onto what its crew believed was the primary threat, the 4 remaining drones crossed the outer perimeter fence undetected, dropping even lower to just under 150 feet, close enough now that ground clutter from scattered farm buildings and a rail embankment helped mask their radar return almost completely. But the Eastern Panzer battery, the one brought online as a precaution, had not yet committed to a target. Its operator, more cautious than his counterpart to the north, kept scanning a wider arc instead of narrowing in on the obvious decoy activity. At 2.5 miles, his radar caught something the northern battery had missed entirely: a faint, low return moving steadily along the drainage ditch that ran almost in a straight line toward the runway apron. This was the second real obstacle of the night: an alert crew who had refused to be distracted by the decoy, exactly the kind of variable that no amount of pre-mission planning could fully account for. At almost the same moment, Base Command made the decision to scramble a MiG-31 held on standby alert nearby, hoping a manned interceptor could close the gap that ground-based systems alone might not cover in time. The pilot, roused from a cold ready room less than 4 minutes earlier, was still strapping into his harness as ground crews pulled the aircraft's chocks and cleared it for an emergency takeoff roll. In theory, a MiG-31 climbing out at full afterburner could reach altitude and intercept speed within minutes, more than fast enough to matter in a fight measured in seconds rather than hours. In practice, spinning up a cold aircraft, running pre-flight checks under pressure, and getting airborne from a base that was itself under active attack introduced a chain of delays that no amount of pilot skill could shorten. By the time the MiG's wheels left the runway, the inbound drones were already inside the base perimeter, close enough that any air-to-air engagement risked the interceptor's own weapons causing damage on the ground, far worse than the threat it was meant to stop. The pilot was ordered to hold a wide orbit above the base instead. A spectator to an engagement his own aircraft had arrived just minutes too late to influence. The Eastern Panzer fired a single missile at the lead drone in the inner formation. The Ukrainian UAV's onboard warning receiver caught the missile's terminal guidance radar activating and reacted within a fraction of a second, cutting engine power and dropping nearly 25 feet almost straight down, using the drainage ditch itself as cover. The missile's proximity fuse triggered against empty air above the ditch, the explosion close enough to shred one wing panel with shrapnel but not close enough for a direct kill. The drone wobbled, power fluctuating as the flight controller fought to compensate for the damaged wing surface, but it held altitude and continued forward, now flying noticeably slower and less stable than the 3 drones still beside it. The near miss had cost precious seconds. Seconds the mission timeline had not accounted for. Every extra second spent stabilizing meant 1 more second of exposure to whatever defensive layer waited next. And in this kind of penetration mission, exposure time was the single resource that could never be recovered once spent. That next layer arrived almost immediately. Parked along the base's access road, a Krasuka 4 electronic warfare vehicle, normally held in reserve for larger coordinated air raids, had been brought forward earlier in the week as part of a general readiness posture following intelligence chatter about increased Ukrainian long-range activity. Its operator, alerted by the 2 intercepts already reported to the north and east, activated a wide-band jamming sweep across the frequencies most commonly associated with Ukrainian UAV control links. For roughly 40 seconds, the effect was significant. 2 of the remaining 3 drones, which still relied on periodic satellite relay corrections to fine-tune their terrain-following accuracy, lost that correction signal entirely, forcing their onboard systems to fall back on inertial navigation alone, a method accurate enough to hold general course, but prone to slow, compounding drift the longer it operates without a fix. The lead, damaged drone, already flying degraded, drifted nearly 200 feet off its planned line, angling closer to a lit guard post than the mission plan had ever intended. For a moment, it seemed as though the jamming alone, without a single missile fired, might be enough to unravel the entire approach. But the drones had been built with exactly this scenario in mind. Each airframe carried a secondary navigation reference, a set of preloaded visual landmarks, the outline of a specific water tower, the angle of a rail junction, the shape of a distinctive grain silo cluster matched against a low-resolution onboard camera feed, even when no live video was being transmitted anywhere. As the lead drone passed within visual range of the rail junction marked in its memory weeks earlier, its navigation computer recognized the match, corrected its drift in a series of small step turns, and pulled itself back within 200 feet of its intended line, just close enough to keep the mission alive. The Krasuka operator, watching his jamming indicators show strong signal suppression across the targeted frequencies, reported the sector as neutralized and shifted his attention to scanning for any secondary threats along a different bearing, unaware that the very drones he believed he had blinded were already correcting course using a method his equipment had no way of detecting or disrupting. Inside the base, ground crews were still refueling 2 Tu-95 bombers on the apron, radios crackling with reports of intercepts to the north and east, but no clear picture yet of how many threats remained inbound or from which direction the real danger was coming. At 3 miles out, a second layer of defense revealed itself. A Russian interceptor UAV patrol, cheap, fast, and expendable, tasked purely with ramming incoming threats before they reached the flight line. Two interceptors dropped out of a holding pattern above the base and dove toward the damaged lead Ukrainian drone, correctly identifying it as the slowest and most vulnerable target in the group. The lead UAV did not attempt to evade in the conventional sense. Its onboard computer had already calculated, based on remaining battery reserves and the damaged wing's reduced control authority, that outrunning a lighter, faster interceptor was simply not possible at this range. Instead, it cut its engine entirely, dropping nearly 20 feet in under a second, falling below the interceptor's dive path exactly as it had trained to do minutes earlier against the missile. The lead Russian interceptor shot through empty air where its target had been a heartbeat earlier and, with no explosive warhead of its own and no room left to pull out of its dive, plowed directly into frozen ground beyond the tree line, disintegrating on impact. The second interceptor adjusted its approach, banking hard to correct for the sudden drop, but by then, the remaining Ukrainian formation had scattered into a wide spread, each of the three healthy drones taking a different final approach vector, forcing the interceptor pilot on the ground to choose a single target rather than threaten the whole group at once. He chose the drone flying widest to the south, correctly guessing it had the most direct sightline to the runway, but incorrectly assuming it was the priority target. The chase that followed lasted just under 90 seconds, an eternity in a fight measured otherwise in single-digit seconds. The southern drone, aware it was being pursued through its rear-facing proximity sensor, began a series of shallow, unpredictable weaves, never committing to a hard turn that would bleed too much airspeed, but never holding a straight line long enough for the interceptor to settle into a clean firing solution either. The Russian operator, flying by first-person video feed from a ground control station less than 2 miles away, fought a losing battle against latency, a nearly half-second delay between what his camera showed him and what was actually happening in the air, more than enough time for the Ukrainian drone to have already changed direction again by the time he reacted to what he'd seen a moment earlier. Twice the interceptor closed to within 20 feet, close enough that a slight miscalculation on either side would have ended the chase instantly. Both times, the Ukrainian drone dropped altitude at the last possible instant, using ground effect just above a frozen field to disrupt the smaller interceptor's approach angle. On the third attempt, the interceptor operator, growing impatient and aware that every second spent chasing was a second, the other targets were slipping past unopposed, committed to a final aggressive dive. The Ukrainian drone cut hard left instead of down this time, a maneuver its pursuer had not seen in the previous two passes, and the interceptor shot past into open air too low and too fast to recover before clipping the top branches of a windbreak line of trees and spiraling into the frozen field below. While the interceptor closed on that outer drone, the inner two, including the damaged lead UAV now flying on a single working motor and reduced thrust, pushed forward toward the parking apron largely unopposed. At 03:03 hours, with less than half a mile remaining and battery reserves critically low across the surviving airframes, the drones began their terminal approach. The lead drone, still trailing shredded wing fabric from the earlier near miss, dropped its nose and aimed directly for the wing root of a fueled Tu-95 sitting on the apron, ground crew still working beneath its fuselage, completely unaware of what was closing in from the darkness above them. Its shaped charge warhead detonated directly against exposed fuel lines running along the underside of the wing. The resulting explosion tore through the aircraft's fuel tank, throwing a fireball more than 80 feet into the night sky, and igniting a second bomber parked less than 200 feet away, close enough that the shockwave alone blew out cockpit glass on a third aircraft further down the line. The second drone, flying just behind and slightly to the side, struck a maintenance hangar where spare engine components, hydraulic fluid drums, and ground support equipment were stored. The impact collapsed part of the corrugated roof inward and ignited a secondary fire fed by the stored fluids, a fire that would continue burning for hours despite the arrival of base fire crews. The third drone, the one that had drawn the interceptor's attention, arrived seconds later than planned, its pilot forced into a wide evasive loop before finally shaking the pursuing Russian UAV in a low pass over a drainage culvert. Though delayed, it still carried enough momentum and battery charge to reach the runway threshold itself, detonating close enough to crater the surface and force a temporary and total halt to all flight operations at the base, stranding any aircraft that might otherwise have attempted an emergency dispersal takeoff. The fourth drone, the surviving decoy from the earlier engagement, damaged and running on a single rough motor, had never been expected to reach the target at all. Its remaining battery reserve was calculated to be barely sufficient for a controlled crash landing somewhere in open farmland well short of the base. Instead, riding a favorable tailwind that had shifted in the final minutes before dawn, it limped across the perimeter fence at less than 30 feet, engine sputtering, and struck the corner of a fuel storage depot near the base's eastern edge. The resulting fire, though smaller than the main strikes on the flight line, forced an emergency evacuation of nearby personnel and added yet another simultaneous crisis for overwhelmed fire crews already stretched between three separate blazes. Within 4 minutes, what had been one of Russia's most closely guarded strategic assets was burning in 4 separate locations simultaneously. Ground crews scrambled to control the fires, while emergency vehicles struggled to navigate around the newly cratered taxiway, some forced to take long detours around the debris field left by the runway strike. Radio traffic from the base in the minutes that followed painted a picture of confusion rather than coordinated response. Reports of additional inbound threats, most of them false alarms, triggered by the chaos and adrenaline of the moment, continued for nearly 20 minutes after the last Ukrainian drone had already detonated, tying up air defense crews who kept scanning empty sky for aircraft that no longer existed. The MiG-31, still orbiting overhead with nothing left to intercept, was eventually ordered to land at a secondary airfield nearly 90 miles away, since the cratered runway at Engels could no longer safely accommodate a high-speed landing. The aircraft that had been scrambled specifically to defend the base ended the night unable to even return to it. Fire crews faced a problem of sequencing as much as scale. The blaze, consuming the 2 bombers on the apron, demanded immediate foam suppression to prevent the fire from reaching nearby fuel bladders, staged for the next day's operations. The hangar fire, fed by hydraulic fluid and stored engine components, produced thick black smoke that reduced visibility across the entire eastern half of the base to less than 50 feet at ground level, slowing every vehicle movement to a crawl. The fuel depot fire, smallest in scale but most volatile in nature, required a full evacuation radius that pulled emergency personnel away from the apron fire, just as it needed reinforcement most. Base commanders, forced to prioritize which fire received which truck first, effectively had to choose between protecting remaining aircraft, protecting fuel reserves, and protecting personnel, a decision no training exercise had ever fully prepared them to make under live conditions. The strategic value of the strike was not simply the physical aircraft destroyed on the ground, though that damage alone was significant. Every hour Engels remained partially disabled was an hour Russia's long-range bomber fleet could not stage missile launches against Ukrainian infrastructure. A single successful penetration through a 400-mile defensive envelope, using 6 drones that together cost less than a fraction of a single cruise missile fired from one of those very bombers, had done more immediate damage to Russian strike capability than weeks of grinding frontline fighting could achieve. Investigators who reviewed the incident in the days afterward identified a chain of small decisions, each individually defensible, that combined into a single catastrophic failure. The Northern Panzer crew's decision to fully commit to the obvious decoy threat was standard procedure, exactly what years of training had conditioned them to do against the loudest, most visible signal on their scope. The Eastern Battery's more cautious approach very nearly closed the gap entirely, and had its single missile detonated 8 feet closer to the lead drone. The entire mission likely ends there, in a single flash, over a frozen drainage ditch, with 4 other airframes forced to either abort or press on alone into a fully alerted defensive network. The Krasuka jamming vehicle performed exactly as designed against a threat that used live remote control, and its failure was not a flaw in the equipment but a mismatch against an adversary who had already anticipated that specific countermeasure and engineered around it months before the mission ever launched. Even the scrambled MiG-31, arriving minutes too late through no fault of its pilot, represents a defensive posture built for a different kind of war, one where high-value manned interceptors have time to climb, identify, and engage before an attacker reaches its target, rather than reacting after the fact to a strike already unfolding on the ground. There's also a quieter, longer-term cost that does not show up in the smoke and fire of the first few minutes. Every base commander across southern Russia who hears about Engels now has to ask a harder question. If a facility 400 miles from the front, protected by multiple radar systems, 2 Panzer batteries, and an interceptor patrol, could still be penetrated by 6 drones flying a carefully mapped route, then what does that mean for every other base considered safely out of range? Defensive resources that were concentrated near the front now have to be spread thinner across the entire country, diluting coverage everywhere at once. In the days that followed, satellite imagery of the base would show something that no press statement could hide. 2 burned-out airframes on the apron, a collapsed hangar roof, a cratered taxiway patched with fresh gravel, and a scorched corner where the fuel depot fire had finally been brought under control after nearly 6 hours. Repair crews would work around the clock to restore the runway to operational status, but the 2 destroyed bombers were not something that could be patched with gravel and steel plate. Building a single Tu-95 from scratch is no longer even possible using Russia's current industrial base. Every aircraft lost at Engels was permanently subtracted from an already shrinking fleet, with no realistic path to replacement. The psychological effect on ground crews and maintenance personnel stationed at similar facilities across the country is harder to measure, but no less real. For years, these bases operated under the assumption that distance alone was a form of armor, that being hundreds of miles from the front line meant being effectively untouchable. Engels shattered that assumption in under 4 minutes, Every subsequent shift change, every late-night refueling operation, every routine maintenance check now carries a background awareness that did not exist before this night. The quiet knowledge that the sky itself is no longer neutral territory, even this far from the war. This is what asymmetric warfare looks like in practice. 6 drones, a fraction of the cost of a single interceptor missile, fired to stop them, forced a nuclear-capable strategic air base to fight for its own survival for 4 uninterrupted minutes, and left it counting losses for hours afterward. What do you think mattered most here? The 4 months of radar gap mapping before a single drone ever launched, the decoy sacrifice that pulled the Northern Panzer's attention away at the critical moment, or the split-second engine cut that let the lead drone slip beneath both a missile and an interceptor in the same night? Let me know in the comments. Goodbye.